example. There is a reason, even within the United States, there is a reason why Ferrari has dealership in California, in New York, in Florida, but if you look, there are no dealerships, say, in Nebraska, because of the different regional income, right? It's much more likely that a person that lives in California, or in New York, or in Florida, has the income high enough to afford to buy a Ferrari. If they put a Ferrari dealership in Nebraska, the average person in Nebraska probably does not have enough income to, or even the one in the top distribution of income in Nebraska probably doesn't have enough income to afford the Ferrari. And there is, Warren Buffett, fine, but he's not interested in Ferrari, right? So anyway, the income, it matters, right? That's why everybody is so concerned about, having the possibility of doing business in the United States and so on and so forth, right? Transportation costs. Transportation costs are at an all-time low because A, lately the price of gasoline and the price of oil has been low, and B, because we have become monsterly efficient in transporting goods and services. Okay? This is an example of how the Titanic looks when compared to a cruise ship. The cruise ships are smaller than the cargo ships. Most of the cruise ships are smaller than the cargo ships, right? So, when you look at the movie Titanic, the Titanic seems like a giant piece of machine, but then compared to the modern piece of machine that we're capable of building, it doesn't look that impressive at all, right? And, think about cars, right? If you need to import a Japanese car or German car, the cars don't fly. You don't put cars into airplanes because it's very inefficient. Only a certain amount can fit. The airplane has to take off. So you put them in this giant cargo ship and you ship it through the sea. And as I probably mentioned in this class, the 20 biggest cargo ships of the world at the moment consume as much as gasoline as the whole airplane industry in the whole freaking world. Okay? Because when you move this monster in the sea, because the sea creates friction, it takes a lot of diesel. I guess that they run on diesel. It takes a lot of diesel to burn to move this monster in the sea, right? But we became more efficient in the sense that now this vessel, before we had many small vessels going, and now we have this giant vessel that are bringing basically an enormous quantity of goods across the world. So the transportation costs, to make it simpler, are very high nowadays. And that's part of what we label in economics globalization and so on and so forth, because transportation costs now are almost very high. And then the attitude of the governments towards trade are important. If we have imposed a tariff, tariff actually now, on aluminium and steel, that will have an impact on the net exports. But we will see, and I'm going to show you an example where another sort of policy could have an effect on net exports, and that kind of unintended consequences of the policy. Okay, so bear with me in a few slides. I'm going to show you another policy, and not necessarily a policy towards trade, but seemingly unrelated, will have an impact on the net export. Okay, so we're examining the balance of payments, and we saw that one component of the balance of payments is net export, right? But now we have to look at the other component of the balance of payments. So what about the NCO? What can possibly affect NCO? You have to remember what NCO is. The definition of NCO that we gave last time in class, jeez, I always forget the joke. The definition of NCO that we gave last time in class is capital outflow minus capital inflow. But what is capital outflow and what is capital inflow? So, some students asked me at the end of last class, why do we call it capital outflow and capital inflow? These are financial capital, not physical capital. What this capital outflow means, I am a US resident and I want to buy stocks on the Tokyo stock market for Sony. So if I want to bring dollars outside of the United States to buy this stock, from the perspective of the United States, this would be a capital outflow. On the other hand, there is a Greek citizen, and he or she wants to buy government bonds inside the United States. So they bring their financial capital inside the United States and buy US bonds. So that would be considered a capital inflow. Okay? So what potentially is affecting that capital outflow? Well, obviously, the rate of return on the bonds in the United States versus the rate of return on the bonds abroad, or the rate of return of the stocks abroad versus the rate of return of the stocks of the United States. So the real interest rate is important. And on top of that, what you have to keep in mind, the real interest rate is computed with local currency. So you have to make also the adjustment for the currency. What does it mean? Suppose that I buy the Sony Stock Corporation in the Tokyo stock market. And suppose that the stocks is 100 yen. And then suppose that I'm going to get a dividend of 3 yen a year. So some of you may be thinking, okay, that's 3 yen, the dividend that it gives you, you pay the stock at 100, so the rate of return is 3%. And that's correct, but it's in yen. The 3 yen is in local currency, right? If I want to compare the rate of return of the Sonic stock with the rate of return of the Apple stock, I have to also look at the exchange rate. So I look at the Apple stock, again, hypothetically, say I buy Apple stock for $100, and Apple gives me a rate of return of $2. Well, you may be tempted to conclude the rate of return on Apple is 2%, the rate of return on Sony stocks in Japan is 3%, so you should definitely buy the Sony stocks, right? But then you have to keep into consideration how much does $2 buy in terms of Japanese yen. Make sense? Because it's true that in nominal local currency, 2% versus 3% is important, but is $2 more than 3 yen? Is $2 less than 3 yen? That will play a decision, will play a role in your decision to buy Japanese stocks versus American stock. Make sense? So all these rate of return need to be cleared out for the exchange rate. Then obviously, you are not going to buy an asset in a country that is perceived to be high risk. So for example, typically investor, when there is an election that is contentious in some country, they hold on because they want to see the outcome of the election. Who's going to win, what's their attitude, what's their policy, and so on and so forth. Typically investor, when there is high risk of bankruptcy for either banks or even default for the country, they hold on. If you don't want to buy, probably in 2011 or in 2010, you didn't want to buy, if you were an international investor, bonds from Greece, because there was a bargaining between Greece and the European Union about how to restructure their debt, how to change their fiscal situation, and so on and so forth. So a lot of people were not buying this type of asset. And lastly, the attitude of the governments towards financial investment are important. In the United States, we are very open. So as long as a foreign entity or a foreign household doesn't want to buy stocks of corporations that are considered of national interest for the security, then everything else pretty much is okay, as long as we can track them out, right? But other governments are not so keen on foreigners buying their company. Okay, so just to give you an example, if a Chinese investor wants to buy 5% of Apple, the government of the United States has nothing to say about that. It's a private transaction. They will have some friction with the current ownership structure of Apple, but there is nothing wrong with that, right? If a US investor goes to China and tries to buy 5% of Tencent Technology, which is the company that is owning WeChat, just to give you an example in our technology, the government of China does not allow that. Does not allow that. They don't allow foreigners to buy huge stake in a domestic company yet. Okay? We will see probably in the next few years that's going to change, right? But at the moment, that's not the case. So that obviously affects the net capital outflow between the United States and China. Okay? Any question? When you understand this balance of payments and what affects what, and what affects net export and what affects net capital outflow, it is very interesting, in my opinion, to go back and do some of the simple algebra that we were doing with the expenditure equation to the GDP, so that we can reinterpret the issue of trade deficit. Remember that I spent sometimes a couple of lectures ago and saying trade deficit is not a big deal, and I'm going to show you also why it is not a big deal by a simple reinterpretation. Instead of thinking to trade deficit in terms of imbalance between goods and services, I'm going to think in terms of trade deficit in terms of imbalance between assets and savings and investment in particular. How do I do that? This is our standard expenditure equation that if you go back and you recall, I told you that we would keep it basically until the last day of class, the last week of class. And that's what we're doing. In this equation, I subtract from both sides consumption and government spending. When I subtract from both sides consumption and government spending, I have real GDP minus consumption minus government spending. Consumption gets cancelled and government spending gets cancelled on the right hand side. So on the right hand side, I have just investment plus net export. If you recall from the second part of the course, this again, try to keep up and review the material. From the second part of the course, we defined this as national savings, which was the sum of public savings and private savings. But this expression, this difference between real GDP, consumption, and government spending, was national savings. And on the right hand side, we have investment plus net export. Okay? So national savings is equal to investment plus net export. But I just showed you a couple of slides ago that from the balance of payments, net export must be equal to net capital outflow. And so now we have that savings is equal to investment plus net capital outflow. What does this equation say? This is an equation that we're going to use today and moving forward that explain the international financial market for loanable funds. What does this equation say is that we can allocate our national savings in two ways. We can allocate our national savings to domestic investment, or we can allocate them at the international level. So if you have $1 million of savings, you can decide to put $500,000 in the bank, and the bank will give loans to the local domestic firms. Or you can allocate the remaining $500,000 by buying stocks in Japan, bonds in Greece, bonds in Argentina, whatever you like. Okay? And the foreigner can do the same. That's why we have net capital outflow, because they could allocate their money to buy stocks of the United States, put their money in bank of the United States, and so on. Okay? So why this is interesting and instructive? Because now we can again reinterpret the trade deficit in terms of assets. We know that net export is equal to net capital outflow, but from this equation, net capital outflow is equal to savings minus investment. So, if net export is equal to net capital outflow, and net capital outflow is equal to savings minus investment, if I have a trade deficit, so if NX is negative, what does this imply for savings and investment? It implies that the savings must be smaller than investment. And this can be due to two reasons, or a combination of the two. It could be due to the fact that the savings domestically are very small, or it could be due to the fact that the investment domestically is very high, or a combination of the two. Make sense? So, reinterpretation of the trade deficit in this slide. It's not goods and services across country that really matters, but it is how much savings we have with respect to our investment. It's all about us, not about somebody else. Take responsibility. It's all about us. Okay? how much savings do we have versus how much investment do we have. Not about, you know, our country. Just to give you another idea, you remember that I was mentioning before, let me go back a second because I show you what I was mentioning. There are some government policy that not necessarily related to trade that will affect the net export. How do I know? Well, now I can show you. In December of 2017, the president decided to, and not only the president, but the government of the United States decided to cut corporate taxes in the United States from 35% to 19%. And if you think in our macroeconomy model, this means that it's going to boost investment. Do you agree? Because the tax on corporate revenue will go down from 35% to 19%, 16 percentage point cut. We should observe that domestic investment will flourish and will increase. Make sense? But what does this imply now, in light of this lecture that we are having today, for our trade deficit? Yeah?
Increase NCO.
It will?
Potentially, depending on how much they invest in foreign factors versus domestic factors.
So just bear with the algebra, right? If I goes up, will NCO goes up or go down?
Go down.
Decrease NCO, right? If NCO goes down, what happens to net exports? Goes down. So it means that this cut of corporate taxation will induce trade deficit. So I'm just putting it right there. Is this consistent with the fact that the president and the administration doesn't like to have trade deficit, and that's why he imposed aluminum and steel tariff on China? They don't like trade deficit, so they say, let's impose tariff on China from steel and aluminum so that the trade deficit will decrease. Okay, is that consistent with a policy that cuts corporate taxes and will induce a trade deficit? Doesn't seem so consistent. I'm just putting it out there. Right? Doesn't seem so consistent. If you think that trade deficit is bad for the economy, either you boost the savings, or you cut the investment. That's simple algebra. Okay? What we observe is that historically there has been trade deficit because we had low savings. That's what happened in the 80s, in the 2000s, and now. Now actually we are doing better, so our savings is increasing. Or we had trade deficit because there is an absolute boost of investment, what we should observe in the next few months and years after we give the corporate taxes. And this is something that was happening in the 90s when all the dot-com company that we're using to great extent today were founded, right? So there was a boom in the Silicon Valley of investment because of this dot-com that turns out to be a bubble to some extent, but that's what we see the trade deficit. And the idea is very simple. If you need to boost your investment, like we probably will need in the next few years, the corporation will want to boost their investment because of the cut in corporate taxation. If we do not have enough domestic savings to keep up with that, what the firms will do, they will go abroad and ask, can you lend me the money? Because I want to invest more in my country. They go to a foreign bank, they go to a foreign entity, and they will get the money, and that will be a capital inflow, so NCO will go down, and the net export will go down. Make sense? Everybody understood? Question or things that you didn't understand?
Yes, I just wanted to ask, what is the rationale again if you're imposing the tariffs on companies, meaning your investment is going to go down?
No, if we're going to come back to that Wednesday, So she's asking, why, if you are imposing tariffs on Chinese aluminum and Chinese iron, what would that be the rationale to cut the net export, right? We're going to come back to that exactly on Wednesday, because I don't think we will get there today, but maybe we'll do towards the end of today's class. But the idea is simply net export is equal to exports minus imports, right? And now it's negative. Net exports is negative, right? Because we are a trade deficit. So the president says, or the administration says, let's impose tariff on Chinese steel and aluminum. So this automatically brings the imports down, because now importing aluminum and steel from China will decrease, right? And if this decrease, this will go up. So we not have as much as a trade deficit as before, but less trade deficit, right? But we will see that there are unintended consequences, right? And again, either we're going to do it today or tomorrow, but I can give you some preview. The things that the Chinese did a few days later after the president approved this imposition of tariffs on steel and aluminum were to pass a legislation in China, which you say, okay, you don't want us to export aluminum and steel to you, you don't export pork to us, right? And so they impose tariff on pork. They cannot, so the trade war that they are talking about a lot in the news is when you start to trade, literally to impose tariffs and quota on the same goods. Then it's basically declaration, open declaration of war, right? You tax my steel and you tax my aluminum, I'm gonna tax your steel and I'm gonna tax your aluminum, right? But the soft war that is currently going on is, okay, you tax more my aluminum and my steel, I'm gonna tax more your pork or another goods, okay? And we see that if I tax more pork, then the big packing industry will be able to export less. And so this will offset each other, and we're gonna see. Okay? All right, now we're gonna try to put everything together, everything that we learned so far, definition of net export, definition of net capital outflow, definition of balance of payment, all this will be brought together to look at a modern way of thinking in terms of open economy at the macro level, okay? And in particular, when we try to do that, we are gonna have to look at two financial markets at the international level. And these two financial markets are the one that we just saw, the market for loanable funds at the international level. Savings is equal to investment plus net capital outflow. But then there will be a subtle that we always a little bit neglected, but today we're gonna make it explicit. If you want to buy an asset abroad, or if you want to buy goods abroad, you need to have their currency. If the foreigners want to buy an asset inside the United States, or they want to buy goods from the United States, they need to have our currency. So we're gonna have to make explicit what constitutes the market for currency. Okay? And that's what we're gonna do today. But the first market needs some more explaining. So everybody knows what is savings now. Everybody knows what's domestic investment now. And we know the definition of net capital outflow. Question for you so that you can start again the process of reviewing the material. From the second part of the course, is saving upward sloping or downward sloping with respect to the real interest rate? Upward sloping. Question for you from the second part of the course. Is domestic investment upward sloping or downward sloping with respect to the real interest rate? Downward sloping, right? So we didn't see yet what's NCO doing with respect to the real interest rate. Preview of the results so that you are aware of where we're going. because it's on the demand side, NCO will be downward sloping with respect to the real interest rate. But I have to prove it to you. Okay? So that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of time on. I'm going to try to prove you that NCO is downward sloping with respect to the real interest rate. And the way that I prove it to you is the following, right? So far, in the second part of the course, savings was upward sloping with respect to the real interest rate, investment was downward sloping with respect to the real interest rate, but we don't know what NCO is doing. And the way that I show you that the NCO is downward sloping with respect to the real interest rate is the following. Remember first the definition of NCO. Capital outflow minus capital inflow. You have to fix the world interest rate at a certain level, something that we cannot affect. There are some interest rate at the world level that is given and we cannot affect, okay? So the world interest rate, say, for example, is 5%, okay? That's the rate of return of stocks and bonds abroad after you take into consideration the exchange rate. Suppose that the United States rate of return is 10%, okay? Suppose that she is an investor in the United States, she has $100,000, and suppose that he is an investor from New Zealand, he has 100,000 New Zealand dollars. And they both know that the world interest rate is 5% and the interest rate in the United States is 10%. She has $100,000 and she needs to say, should I buy bonds in the United States or should I buy bonds in New Zealand? What do you think, or what do you think you should do? Again, she has $100,000 of the United States. The rate of return of bonds in New Zealand, after you consider the exchange rate, is 5%. The rate of return of bonds in the United States, after you consider the exchange rate, is 10%. What should she do? Buy the US. Okay? So if she buys the US, what happens to capital outflow? Decrease. Good. Now let's go to the New Zealander. He has 100,000 New Zealand dollars, and he has exactly the same information that she has. She has to decide, should I put my 100,000 New Zealand dollars in bonds of New Zealand, or should I put my $100,000 in bonds of the United States? Bonds of the United States pay 10% after you consider the exchange rate. Bond of New Zealand pays 5% after you consider the exchange rate. What should he do? Bond of the US. So from the perspective of the United States, what happens to capital inflow? He brings the money inside the United States, so the capital inflow in the United States, is it going up or is it going down? Up. This goes down, this goes up. Overall, net capital outflow is low. You agree? So when the rate of return is 10%, we must have a low net capital outflow. Make sense? Second step. We have the investor from the US, we have the investor from New Zealand. The world interest rate is 5%, we didn't touch it, still there. But for whatever reason, now the rate of return of the US bonds, after you consider the exchange rate, drops to 1%. What should she do? Buy the bonds in New Zealand, because the bond in New Zealand now gives 5% interest rate, the bond in the United States gives 1% interest rate, so she should buy now the bonds in New Zealand. And if she does buy the bond in New Zealand, what happens to the capital outflow? Is she bringing the money outside of the United States into New Zealand or not? Yes, so capital outflow goes up. Let's go to the New Zealander investor. He has $100,000 in New Zealand dollar. And he has the same piece of information. The world interest rate, so the New Zealand bonds, give a rate of return of 5%. The US bonds give a rate of return of 1%. So what should she do? Buy New Zealand bonds. So from the perspective of the United States, there will be no capital inflow, and the capital inflow goes down. This goes up, this goes down. Overall, the net capital outflow will be high. So when the interest rate is low, 1%, the net capital outflow will be high. So I have just described 2 points in this plane, and it's inside by geometry, things that you learn when you were like this tall. Okay? Between 2 points, there is only one straight line. The NCO is downward sloping with respect to the derivatives. Okay? Make sense? I just proved you that the net capital outflow is downward sloping with respect to the real interest rate. Why is this useful? Because now I know the lemma showing up here. Because this is the curve for the demand, and this is the curve for the supply. This is savings, and this is investment plus NCO. This was kind of important just to set the tone of the market, right? So that's what we learned. But again, I told you that there is a market for currency, and this is where sometimes students get confused. We need to decide in the market for currency what represents demand and what represents supply. And the book takes this decision, which I totally agree with. And the book says, well, the demand for a currency, so the demand for dollar, is represented by net exports. And the book says it's not really the demand, and I'm going to explain you that difference because it's not a tiny difference. But the book calls it the net demand for dollars. So this net is important, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. And then the book says we decide about the supply of dollars by looking at the NCO. The NCO represents the net supply of dollars, and that's going to be important. Again, the fact that it's net, what this net means. Okay? Why is net exports the net demand for dollars, and why is the net capital outflow the net supply of dollars? I'll give you just one example. Suppose that you are a German Airlines and you want to buy new airplanes. So what you do, you can decide to buy new airplanes for Boeing, or you can decide to buy airplanes for Airbus. These are basically the only 2 huge companies at the international level that sells airplanes. Boeing is located inside the United States, in Seattle. Suppose that you're a German Airlines and you decide, I'm going to put an order for 20 new Boeings. Okay? Think about what happens. The Boeings are priced in dollars because Boeing is located in Seattle. They want dollars. So if you are the German company, what you need to do in order to buy this airplane, there is an intermediate step. They have money in German currency, which is euro. They need to go out in this phantomatic currency exchange market, and they need to procure for themselves dollars in exchange for euros, so that then they can buy the airplane. Make sense? But they need to get the dollar first. Make sense? So the exports of Boeing, from the perspective of the United States, the fact that Boeing is selling the airplane is an export, right? So the exports constitutes demand for dollars. Make sense? Everybody understood? This would be a good time to exercise your muscle here. Do this or do this, but one of the 2. You understand that the exports of Boeing from the United States to Germany constitutes demand for dollars. The German company needs to procure the dollars and ask for dollars to buy the Boeing, right? That's one transaction that entered in the export. How about Ferrari? Suppose that you, exactly yourself, once you graduate, you want to buy yourself a Ferrari and you live in the United States. Okay? Ferrari are produced so far only in Italy. And they are priced in euros because the Ferrari is a company that is located in Italy. So, in order for you will go inside, obviously, a dealership and don't worry about this, but conceptually, in order for you to buy a Ferrari from Italy, you have the dollars, you offer the dollar in exchange for the euros. Make sense? You want the euros, but you're offering the dollars because that's what you have. So the Ferrari, which would be an import from the perspective of the United States, constitute a supply of dollars in exchange for euros. Okay? Make sense? Now, let's go back to the example of the New Zealander versus the US investor. He wants to buy as a New Zealander, he has $100,000, and he wants to buy US bonds. What does he have to do? He has to sell his New Zealand dollar and demand for the US dollar before he can buy the US bonds. So the capital inflow, the New Zealander wanting to buy US bonds, constitutes demand for dollar. He is demanding dollars so that then he can buy US bonds. Let's go back to her. She is a US investor and has to decide whether to buy New Zealand bonds or not. She has US dollar, she wants to buy New Zealand bonds. She's supplying US dollars in exchange for New Zealand dollars so that she can buy New Zealand bonds. That would be considered a capital outflow, and that constitutes supply of dollars. Notice, these are the four generic movements. So you have demand for dollars, supply of dollars, demand for dollars, supply of dollars. Let's put together all the demand and all the supply. This is demand and this is demand. So you have export plus capital inflow is demand for dollars. This is supply and this is supply, so you have import plus CO would be the supply of dollars. But now if you notice, this is goods and these are assets. This is goods and these are assets. So it's very hard to sum them up. And that's why you rearrange it, right? And you have exports minus imports is equal to capital outflow minus capital inflow. And that's why the book decided should be the net demand for dollar and this should be the net supply of dollar. Make sense? Yes? Do I need to repeat anything? Question, things that you didn't understand? Okay. Once you have the demand for dollars, the supply of dollar figured out, and once you have the market for the currency figured out, and once you have the international financial market figured out, next time we put them all together and we do policy. In particular, we're going to do 3 policies. The things that she was asking before, what if we have a buy only American campaign? And then we're going to see what if we have a trade deficit, debt, increasing debt, okay? But we're going to see next time. Next.